I hit the music and the show begins. Paralyzed by fear, I'm clutching you so tight, afraid to lose. I retreat more each night. Where is my voice? I've muted myself, and in my shyness, it's you I repel. I will find my way to express my voice. I must find my way to ignite my spark. Find my way to me, so we can be we. Find my way. The fractions between us rise into view. I cling to the scraps of the care that falls through. Where is my strength? I've crumbled apart, hiding from the truth. I've shattered my heart, but I will find my way to regain my strength. I must find my way to restore my will. Find a way to me, so we can be we. Find my way. Here is this moment to take a chance, to go on alone or grow and advance. I will find my way to express my voice. I must find my way to ignite my spark. Find my way to me, so we can be we. Find my way. I will find my way to regain my strength. I must find my way to restore my will. Find my way to me, so we can be we. Find my way. Find my way. I'll find my way. Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope your sheltering in place is going well. And you, if you don't know where you are, you're at Sunday Live. Every Sunday, 5 o'clock to 6 p.m. We present myself and a guest who has played a key role in my life, in my music and art creative career. And that's the sound of them rustling around in the woods right now. Welcome, Joe. All right, so our guest this week is Dan Wyman, composer, professor, and musician. For those who...
Good afternoon.
Hello, Dan. And for those that know me well, you'll know that I went to San Jose State University, and that's where I first met Dan.
Look at that picture.
Before I knew Dan...
I had to have an argument with the administration to make them allow a picture with my hat on.
That's you?
Just try and get a driver's license.
So that was a little clip. Dan is well known amongst the horror film aficionados for his early soundtrack work with John Carpenter, but also doing the
well, I'll let him explain all the technical terms, but most people would say arranging and composing on Apocalypse Now. He did cues for Missing, a bunch of other films, including some early horror films and science fiction films. If you have any questions, let me move the microphone so I don't have people texting over my face. All right, great. If you have any questions for Dan, put them in the chat room. We are running live on Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube, and it looks like all of those feeds are this week coming into the one centralized place and posting on screen so we can see you. Give you a little bit of background on Dan, his bio. Here's his bio from San Jose State University. When I first met Dan, I didn't know he was an infamous composer of horror films. He was just the guy who opened up the door to recording. And when I was a child in 6th grade, as usual, my voice is going today. When I was in 6th grade, I had my first, what back there you'd call nervous breakdown. I was stressed out about school, society's pressure. I was asking big questions, wasn't getting answers from the adults around me, was frustrated with that. And my mom said, well, me and your aunt, are going away to Tahoe for the week to stay in a cabin. Why don't you come with us? One of the many moments in which my mom played a pivotal role in setting the projection of my life and supporting the path that I chose. So I asked for all my schoolwork, went up to Tahoe, got in this cabin, and in one day did like 3 weeks of schoolwork. And I realized at that moment it wasn't me. But the environment I was growing up with didn't work for me. 2 other key things happened on that trip. One of them was I was turning through the channels late at night on a little black and white TV, and on come this movie where there were people playing early primitive man, banging on bones and whatnot. I thought, what is this? This is not Gilligan's Island. This is something different. I have to watch this. And I watched all of 2001 on a small black and white TV, and it blew my socks off. Just imagine what it did when I saw it in color. And a big screen. I have actually seen it in 70 millimeter on a big screen as well. And one other thing happened cinematically that weekend. Close Encounters had just come out. And my mom said, let's go to the movie. What do you want to watch? And I picked Close Encounters because I was all into the aliens and Eric Von Däniken, ancient alien stuff for a little time there before I grew out of it. Oh, now it's a TV series. Anyhow, but back then, I went and saw this film. And the moment at the end sequence in which a man stepped up to a keyboard and pressed notes, and I heard music and I saw lights responding to the music, I said, that's what I want to do. I want to do that. I don't know what the heck that is, but I want to do that. And my poor mom growing up in San Jose had no idea where the synthesizer was or this keyboard thing that I was looking for. So we ended up with a piano, which was not quite what I was shooting for, but at least it gave me some basic keyboard skills. And I forever thank you, Mom. I know you're on here. You're always on my shows. Thank you for getting that piano, even though I never properly learned anything more to play than for release. So years go by. I've convinced myself I want to be a clinical psychologist because, well, all of my friends come to me with their problems and I seem to help. And I don't seem to be really great at anything else, so that's what I do. And then I'm at San Jose State University, continuing to do choral singing like I have since I'm 4. And somehow, at some point, I saw a little bulletin about recording. And I took a recording one-on-one class. It was this little, I think they called it the closet, and had a little 4-track recorder, a keyboard that I could sequence like 16 chords at a time before I had to hit the recorder. And you know, that fur lease I learned on the piano, Mom, I programmed into that synthesizer. It was my first inputting of data into a synthesizer, and I recorded it, and it's on one of my early albums. So the class was taught by Daniel Wyman.
We put you in the closet and you kept going.
Then I went to the big room. I got the key access, and this was a key. There wasn't a door key code yet when I started in the big studio, and in the big studio there was just a lock, and you had to get it. No, you had to get in there before the other person left, or you were locked out of the room or something. It was not great. So everybody figured out the duct tape. Everybody had, stored their personal duct tape, because if you had to go to the bathroom or anything, there was no way to get back in. You had to duct tape the door, run down the hall really fast before anybody busted you and get back. Did you know about that, Dan? No, he's going to plead the fifth on that. So I went to San Jose State University. Originally, I wanted to go to Cal. I had attended some psychologist classes there. I thought I was going to be a nice big Berkeley psychologist. And then the financial reality hit. And my parents had an auto shop, and every single asset in that auto shop was held against me financially. And I would spend most of my educational career having to work a job to get through university. But after 6 years, I got effectively 2 bachelors. I was 3 single units that had to be taken in a row away from my music bachelor's. I decided to go ahead and move on and consider that a minor, just a overdone minor. During that time, I worked on the first Audio Terrorist albums. Some of the material had been before that, but most of the good stuff came out of the San Jose State University experience. That is all on the Audio Terrorist Experimental Behavior album. And here's some pictures of the big room. Once I was worthy enough to move on to the more advanced class, there was a big room with a big recording console. We had a couple pianos in there, one that had been warped by many days of being in the sun. It had a great, what later would be called 9-inch nails sound. That was before the day, right? And here's my buddy Kadar programming at the little Macintosh computer, which we just thought was like, incredible. Here's the E2. I did a bunch of stuff on the E2. And I don't know if you know this, Dan, but Depeche Mode did all their mid-'80s stuff on the E2s. They carried 4 plus E2s. And the thing I loved about the E2 is it's the only honest piece of technology I've ever used. Because when you powered it up, a little screen would say, this will take a little while. And I thought, well, I can respect that. I can respect that you're being honest with me. Great sampler. The 5 1/4-inch floppies. If it computer people remember when floppies were big and paper and floppy in there. And this was the first, some pictures here of Kadar and Chechi, which were the first live Audio Terrorist members. Everything before that was more improv, performance art based, but they were the first time I tried to put a band faced on Audio Terrorist. Audio Terrorist has continued to be an amalgam.
Look at that piano there.
The Steinway or the honky tonk?
No. The one behind it. There's a story to tell about that.
Oh,
ready?
What's the story? What's the story, Dan?
The story on that brown piece of a piano there with a full keyboard is that was an in-use practice piano in the far practice room of the music building at San Jose State. It had been there since the building was constructed in 1954 and had probably been in the previous building before that. No one would practice on it because all of the hammers had gotten hard. And Eric, our piano technician, refused to replace all of the hammers on this old piano. It was just absurd to do that. And somebody found it might have been you, and said, this is the world's greatest tack piano on the face of the earth. And we pushed it down out of that practice room into the recording studio where it stayed for years and years and years. Got harder and harder. And boy, that was featured on so many recordings.
It was an awesome piece. I mean, you could get it at the harp. So I remember going there and doing the whole harp plucking on a couple tracks and hitting some chords. And it was great because it took things in a different way. You'd hit a key and all of a sudden it went at sound and now you're in a different chord. Awesome. We also did the Steinway with a contact mic and the 414s. And I thank you for anybody that doesn't know, this room would have been an empty husk if it wasn't for Dan's hard work to try to get some gear to us students in San Jose. I definitely felt like I grew up in a backwater and I went to a backwater university. I remember when I started, the chairs in the psych department were the ones from elementary school with the little built-in desk piece. And I was like, oh my God, this is not Cal. I got to make more money. Maybe if I stay here 2 years, I can get to Cal. But faithfully, I didn't, and I met Dan, and he opened up this recording studio to me. And again, all the early recordings were done there. Some of the stuff that appeared on later Audio Terrace albums as instrumentals were actually started here. And folks, this was back in the day of tape, reel-to-reel tape. And I don't even know if in this
That's
first
right.
picture the Symptom box was in there yet. Maybe.
Probably that was also a trade I made for doing something for somebody up in what was then just the beginnings of Silicon Valley as a video and sound production, digital video and sound production foundation in the industry. And so it was fun to do bits and pieces of consultancy in return for equipment, and just about everything you see in there was gleaned for the studio by exactly that process.
Now,
So, that was fun.
This
I love
mixing
seeing
board,
those pictures.
this mixing board, I was told was from Heart, the band.
Yes, that's right. That was a if you bring a truck up to the Hart studio, we'll give it to you. There it is. And
Yep.
oh, that's a great picture of it. That was a fine board. Except that our audio technician for the department swore at me indescribably for great lengths of time while we asked him to put it together. It wasn't something he wanted to do. He wanted to take care of phonographs in classrooms.
And that's a big board, big matrix
Yeah, it was.
patch bay over on the right. We had the
Hart used it on Apocalypse Now, which I worked on for a couple of years. And so we had a connection there, and that was probably why they were willing to unload it to us.
it was on one of their famous records for the fans listening.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't remember what record they would have last created on it.
For me, it was like this world that ever since that sixth grade experience with Close Encounters I'd been looking for. And the only world I'd found was the choral world, and then some show tune kind of Broadway acting stuff. Jazz choir, 16-piece jazz choir. Got to have Bobby McFerrin teach me how to sing the letter J. That's my one Bobby McFerrin story. Caleb, how do you sing J?
You're lucky though.
And I saw him before he became big with the Happy Song. And he was at all the jazz festivals and always available for the kids. And really amazing. And I remember one festival, everybody did these incredible pieces, right? And then it's Bobby. And everybody knew Bobby's going to knock everybody's socks off. And he got up and he did the Beatles' I Want You, She's So Heavy. And he was singing the melody, the bass line, the drum, everything at once. It sounded like he was doing the whole piece at once. And what he was doing was he would hit like a bass note, and then he would hit a note in the melody and then back down, zigzagging up and down, so that it sounded like he was creating the melody and the harmony all in the same time. And I remember also he did Spain, and incredible. And he would jog around the Lake Merritt in Oakland, perfecting his belly and chest tapping. And to this day, I still do that with my wife. She's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Yeah, I got the bass and I got the snare."
It was incredible to have him on the faculty.
I didn't know he was on the
only there
San Jose
for.
State.
Oh, he was only on the faculty for maybe 2 years.
Now, was it Sabatic? Is that the right name? The jazz guy?
Oh, Sabanovich.
Sabanovich. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I took one class with him. I think that was the pop rock songwriting when I learned my basic 1, 4, 5 progression stuff.
But there was a jazz vocalist there who you probably took a class with that brought Bobby in at the moment that Bobby needed some income. And oh my, let's see. Bobby's father was Robert McFerrin, a very famous Metropolitan Opera star. And so Bobby had to truly go off on his own in order to make a name for himself that was not classical and opera, which strangely enough, of course, what does he end up doing? After all those famous albums and Don't Worry, Be Happy, Bobby ends up being the conductor of St. Paul Chamber Orchestra for actually the majority of his professional career, just following after his father's footsteps. But in those years when you came to San Jose State, Bobby needed a living, and you were incredibly fortunate to get to take a class with him. We both, Bobby and I, worked together down for the Summer Arts Festival in San Luis Obispo, put on by the State University. He had a little kid who was about 6 at the time, and I had a little kid who was about 6 at the time. So we took turns taking care of both kids when either one of us was off stage or off teaching. And it was absolutely amazing because Bobby would simply get up on stage, and if the kids were there, he'd just include them in whatever he was doing. One of the most happy people you ever saw on stage. He adored it. The moment he was on stage, he put everybody at ease. Everyone, even students.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. After doing that, I worked with Dan Sabatic. Is that the name?
Sabanovich.
Anyhow, I had to do
Mike West also.
I had to do my, I can't remember. It was like a test you had to pass to continue on. And I did it with him. And I was sitting outside the main choral room, and I'd been doing a lot of work. And as people that know me and been around me a long time, sometimes my voice will do amazing vocals, and a lot of the time it doesn't. It's been very fickle. And it was one of those moments I was sweating bullets, like, I got to pass this thing. And the accompaniment person didn't show up. Nobody showed up. And I'm sitting in the hall, about to go in, and this guy walks by, and it was this instinct. I looked at him, I said, "You play piano?" And he says, "Yeah." "Follow me." And the guy just followed me. And we went in, he walked out the piano. I said, "My Funny Valentine." He goes, "Okay." And I sang My Funny Valentine. And it was one of my most vocal performances of my life. And Sabatovich, he was like, "Who are you? Why aren't you in my class? I want to bring you on the jazz choir." And I'm thinking in my head, "Buddy, you just saw my one great jazz performance." Thank you so much. I'm honored. And much like the philosophy
Did you ever get to work with Mike West there?
I don't think so. I think after that, that was right around the transition point. I quit choral. I realized I was hiding there. And whatever I was or was going to be, I wanted to be it fully, whether it succeeded or failed, which I'm going to bring up a quote from you. And it was this quote that either around that time you said to me, and that was it. It was like, no more choir, no more hiding out in 50 people. And whatever I am, if I'm like the experimental crazy guy who, has to move out to the desert and invent how many tone system did Harry Parch develop? Anyhow, whatever. I got to be one of those guys. I'm going to be that guy. So that was one of the 3 quotes I'll share today that were pivotal from you. And so that led to everything you see behind me and getting into the recording classes and just saying, look, singing will be a part of this. I love singing, but I want to learn how to record and produce and whatnot. Welcome, Tim. I see Tim in the chat room. And so that's right. I think around 88 is when I made that break. Everything before that was one way and everything after that was another way. And I got in the big studio and I just started doing sound collage, and which I had started originally because I didn't have anything at home. Being a working class family, I had a little cassette recorder I had gotten. My sisters got the 10-speed bikes, and I very smartly said, I'm going to inherit those 10-speed bikes when they get older so I can get something different. So I got a little, like a Radio Shack cassette recorder, and I used to record the TV, and then I would find, again, I didn't have any allowance or anything like that, so I would find cassette tapes like thrown in the gutter, and that was my first tape splicing, is I would splice this tape that I found in the gutter together, and I would discover all these bands like Styx and, I think Lou Reed and a bunch of different stuff. And it was funny because these cassettes literally would go from the middle of a song into a completely different album. And that was my sampler collage. That's where my tape collage started. So I started doing that in the big studio, and Kedar, I met him doing that. And I think that my favorite piece from that period, In Theory, where you had us do a granular synthesis project where we took little loops on the computer and stitched them from a bunch of different samples, and then we put it to tape, and then we're using mic stands all around the room to get different lengths of tape, and playing on the samplers and whatnot. That's really, for me, where I see the start of the modern me. Everything else kind of starts there, from a studio performer, multimedia guy. And that's also the year, there's a quote later on that I'll say now. In 88, you looked to me and you said, you heard kind of what I was doing, and you said, there's this thing called multimedia. There's a class over the English department. Go take it. And you have to buy a Macintosh. And again, I'm coming from a working class family, and this guy tells me I got to go buy a $2,000-$3,000 computer. Is he insane? I'm barely making the $325 per semester, by working this night shift at a restaurant and a hotel. And I bless my mother. I said, "Hey, Mom, would you co-sign?" And we went to the student union and bought a Mac SE with an external hard drive, and I think it was a dual floppy unit, and I think you also encouraged us you gave us free tickets to go to, I don't know if it was AES or Macworld. I think it was AES. And walking around.
Audio Engineering Society.
So right. I put in my name in every fishbowl I could, and I heard my name announced. I had won a copy of Alchemy. Do you remember Alchemy? It was a stereo audio editor. It's what actually I did the granular synthesis stuff with. Anyhow, so I had won that. So now I had a Mac, and I had audio editing at home. Granted, it was stereo and maybe like a minute or two or whatever, but that was the start. So I got that, and that Macintosh kept being the brain for my studio until 2000. Because my friend Mike Jennings upgraded the motherboard to SE30, and then I got a daughter card for a 12-inch color monitor, and I just kept that beast going. And most of the gear was on these two big racks, outboard gear, ADAT, DAT tape, Mackie mixer, etc. And that was the setup until probably 2001, when I switched to a Mac 9600, which I'd actually tested at Apple for 3 years. And so that whole PowerPC thing, and then I got a Windows laptop, because after Apple, I'd worked at a Windows-only DVD company. And so, yeah, that moment of you saying that one phrase, this is the power of a professor, right? You don't know who you're influencing and how. And one phrase you said, I got that Mac. And because I got that Mac, that's how I knew Kedar, because he had a Atari or Amiga, and he had Cubase.
Oh, yes. I remember Amigas.
So he bought me for one of my birthdays, my first modem. And he said, you need to be online. And that was like a 14.4 modem going into bulletin boards where, hey, people, you think social media and whatnot's confusing. Imagine a chat room where it's only one room for everybody who's logged on, and there's no little color coded who's answering who. It's literally every line of text everybody is saying. So it's everybody talking at once. It was a very bizarre experience, and eventually you start figuring out who's responding to whom and whatnot. But yeah, that started with that moment. Now we kind of jumped ahead, so I want to go back to the soundtrack intro I did. You did a bunch of soundtracks. Was Assault on Precinct 13 your first soundtrack you worked on?
No, there were a number before that, but that was probably the first complete soundtrack. No, I started by doing commercials, a Toyota commercial for the 1974 or 72 Olympics. I started doing commercials out of the first major electronic music studio in LA, Electron Music's Paul Beaver and Bernie Krause, who did the None Such Guide to Electronic Music, and they were on a Warner Brothers label then. And then I did 5 summer pieces of skateboard film and got to write a ton of skateboard music. That was in the early 70s. And then another film called Metamorphosis by Sanrio Films. It was Ovid, Tales from Ovid. And we did parts of it here and there. They challenged us. We had set up really the first major electronic music studio in Los Angeles with Moog synthesizers. And the producer loved the barber pole effect, which is a very famous MIT sound that was created with computers, in which you hear a rising tone. It goes up and up and up and never seems to get anywhere. You're just hearing this, they call it a barber pole effect, keeps going up. And I was early 20s and starting out sure of myself and said, I can do that, and shot my mouth off in the industry. When that happens, somebody is going to call your bluff. So the producer found out, called us and said, if you do this and it's good enough, you get the film. And if you don't do it, I'm going to tell everybody. Well, we damn well did it.
So I remember this effect. You introduced it to us at San Jose State, and I still have yet to do a piece with it, but I always intended to. It's an incredible thing for folks that haven't heard it. What I'm trying to think of the name of it. Hey, Frank, do you know the name of this? The tone, it sounds like it's going up and down at the same time, but it never stops going up and it never stops coming down. And it's because all the timbre is stripped from the sound, so your mind cannot quite place it, something like that.
Well, the concept is actually very easy. You're decreasing the loudness while one tone producer is going up. And so it starts at the bottom and it's totally quiet in 1 dB by 1 dB until you're in the middle of hearing range, which people have to understand that even though we go all the way to 20,000 cycles, we hear best somewhere around 500 cycles. And so you create a curve that allows the human ear to say, oh, I know that tone. It's right where I am happiest to hear it. But then as it keeps rising, it keeps disappearing. Well, if you have totally in sync sounds starting at octaves, as one starts to disappear to the ear, the other one starts to get louder. And so you have any number of oscillators, sound producing machines that are all perfectly in sync, and they rise all at the same time, but they all get louder and softer in such beguiling degrees that people think it's going nowhere, but it's trying to get somewhere. And that was yeah, it's easier to program on a computer, but it was doable in analog. It was actually doable,
So
and
you
we did it.
started with this bluff, and
Right.
you started doing some scores and some bits and pieces. Here's a bit on some soundtracks you did, and the first, as you said, big soundtrack you worked on was Salt and Precinct 13, which was John Carpenter. You went on to work on his next two films, Halloween and The Fog,
Correct.
and I'm sure I don't. Depends if you want me to put you on your place, put you on the spot here, but how would you describe your role working on those films? And I'm going to show a screen that says how John sees you, but after. But I want to hear it from you first.
John was a graduate student when I was. We were both at USC at the same time, and for his master's, he made a film called Dark Star.
I remember Dark Star.
And he had a mini Moog that he'd borrowed from somewhere, and he and Deborah Hill, his producer and friend, sat there and tried to make a soundtrack to Dark Star, but they couldn't make heads or tails out of the synthesizer, out of the mini Moog. And so I was a TA in electronic music at the time at USC as a graduate student. I got the call from a fellow graduate student filmmaker who said, how do you make this thing work? And I coached him over the phone. So when he got a chance to make a feature film that was Assault on Precinct 13, by that time we had a little studio, and you see the picture there. And so I started working with him on Assault on Precinct 13. Now, to answer your question, John's a good pop keyboard player. He's had a band for years. His dad had a music store and taught music. John's completely seat of the pants, didn't read music, could sit down at the piano and say, I want this theme. Now, if I had a piano in front of me, I would play pop, 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 pop. It was a very catchy little round, if you will. That is to say, after you get through hearing the first part of it, then it just goes back and keeps doing it. So this little theme for Halloween was something that he came in the door with. And same sort of thing with Assault on Precinct 13, but he hadn't quite, at that first movie, he hadn't quite figured out musically how to make a real catch, how to make a hook. He didn't have a hook in Assault on Precinct 13, but he would come in, and we had a very nice little grand piano, and he would play what he wanted, and then we did it on the synthesizer. So my role was to translate his musical ideas and put an accompaniment to it. And that is to say, I orchestrated it. That's exactly what anybody does when a composer writing for film has made all the themes. And if it's a feature film with real money, they don't orchestrate for themselves. There's no time to do that. As they finish each cue, they send out the 2-part or 4-part composition in real music notation to an orchestrator, and the orchestrator is almost 50% of a film. What you hear is what the orchestrator has created with the instruments that will be played for the film. So I was doing the same thing with the synthesizer. I was taking his ideas, none of which were written, however. I was just doing it by ear and orchestrating his ideas. And in the case of Halloween, make no mistake about it. Those fantastic ideas are John's, but the little ticking sound that scares the crap out of everybody that goes along with that theme in Halloween, I put that on there to give it some kind of pulse that would add to the dramatic effect. And as we went through the film, it became a collaboration in a very real sense from an orchestrator's point of view. That's my job. I was a synthesizer orchestrator. In those days, we called ourselves synthesists.
And
a great term.
And the reason why I wanted to kind of discuss this is a lot of folks I know don't do recording studio stuff and don't work on films or work on albums and whatnot. And there is sometimes this, the mythology of the composer, he did it all himself. David Bowie's Low, he did it in his, garage. No, it's Brian Eno and blah, 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 blah. The producer has a big role. Nile Rodgers with Let's Dance. That album wouldn't have been Let's Dance if it was just David strumming on his acoustic guitar. Let's dance. Put on your red shoes, right? Yeah. But no, it's this funk and the rhythm and everything Nile Rodgers brought to that took it from being a song into a hit record. And the word song gets bantered around a lot. And when I'm giving speeches about money making in the music business, the first thing I say is, let's define what a song is, what it legally is in the United States. Let's start there, because I'll get in conversation and say, hey, I'm going to release, you want me to release this track on my record label? Someone say, oh, I got to get approval from my friend that they like the mastering. I said, why? Oh, because they played the bass part. So they were a session musician. You wrote the song. Yeah, I wrote the song, but they played the bass part. I'm like, no, that's not the song. Unless you're Queen doing Under Pressure, it's not the song. That's not the focus. So if you own the lyrics, you own the vocal melody, you own that song, you paid for the production, you hired, whether for free or whatnot, friends to work on it, you get to decide if you release it. Is there any contract involved here? No. Okay. These sorts of conversations I've had with friends who are literally sitting on their work for a decade because they're too paralyzed by worrying about what that one bass player friend of theirs thinks about something they did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I just like to share with people how the industry works and how the different pieces are. When you go see a film and it says composed by, many composers are sitting at a keyboard doing basic riffs and themes and then handing it off to an orchestrator who is rescoring it for the full orchestra. A fine example of this is the early 70s Bowie album, Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and Spider from Mars. David wrote the songs on acoustic guitar, but Mick Ronson, he arranged all that. He's the one that did the string arrangements, the guitar arrangements. And if you heard that album just as a folk album, it would not have the same impact.
Yeah. Well, let me give you another example from the same period. It would be a Bridge Over Troubled Waters, where Larry Knechtel was hired to play on that session. He was really a bass player, but he also played some very nice, very simple piano. And he came up with a hook in Bridge Over Troubled Waters for Simon and Garfunkel that helped make them incredibly famous. Yet he was paid, I hope, double scale for the session, and then you walk away.
Yeah, I mean, everybody plays their role to produce that final product that in many cases becomes legendary. I'm a big Lou Reed fan, and Walk on the Wild Side was produced by David Bowie and Mick Ronson. Mick Ronson, again, had arranged all this stuff, and that extended out into David wanting his idols, whose careers had failed, to reboot them, and he employed Mick to come and do those arrangements and add those hooks. Or in the case of paid session musicians, the famous story with Walk on the Wild Side is the bass player needed more money. So he told them, hey, I'm going to record this. And he recorded with an electric bass. And goes, I think it would sound great if we doubled it with acoustic bass. So they did the acoustic bass recordings. Exactly. And he said he had no more motivation than to get paid twice. But the result of putting those two together is what makes that song really work. Not the song, the singing, the storytelling about New York, that's all a part of it. But the real groove that catches you and pulls you in and hooks you in at first is that bass line.
That's our job as studio musicians. And you know that's the case. I harped on it in classes that you took in the 80s.
Yes, and
I mean, look,
and that was my first.
it's a fair.
Before then, I didn't know how all the pieces fit together and what the roles were. And the role of the pop star.
I
And
remember being told when I was just starting out that here's the concept if you're going to be a studio musician, and many of them have so much phenomenal talent, just phenomenal talent in London, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, but principally New York, Los Angeles, and London. They get scale or double scale union. You get what you get for 3 hours. If a studio musician produces genius, then they've gotten paid, they walk away, and the producer gets a gold record or platinum. But it may be an off day, or they just don't have what the producer wants. They walk away with double scale, and the producer gets nothing and has to go hire somebody else. That's the chance you take, and it works both ways. Except that clearly, I got paid $500 for Halloween, and John's made millions. But hey, that is the chance you take to be a studio musician.
now I remember I was.
Sorry.
I think no. That was great. I remember. I think I was in grad school, and I knew you had worked on Halloween, and I saw a CD of the soundtrack in the store and bought it, and I brought it to you. And we were in the coffee shop, and I said, "Hey, Dan, I just picked up the CD, getting to hear about Halloween," and you were kind of. I think what I remember is you were like, "Interesting. This is in a legal case. It's not supposed to be available." And you speculated that it was because the original contract talked about cassettes and vinyl, and since CDs weren't covered in that original contract, they had squeaked it through there or something like that. And then we opened it up, and there was actually a nice paragraph about your work on Halloween, where John did what I would call a little bit of a confession. And you read that, and you're like, okay, well, that's something. And I'm going to actually show.
Yeah, I mean, he was gracious to me in later years because, I mean, he didn't play synthesizer, not whatsoever. That was my work. I do think that he put his fingers on the keys because I'm a lousy pianist, and played a good number of the lines you hear, but I set it up for him so he could basically transfer what he was doing on piano to a line on synthesizer. And so it was very, very much a coordination. I did feel that I had been taken advantage of after Halloween, and said, John, I ought to have upfront credit. And so in The Fog, I do have upfront credit with him. But as of Halloween, I did my work. He came into our studio, and and by the way, I never saw the film.
I've actually never seen it either. I've seen clips of it, and either I saw it later or because you told me about it, about how the studio didn't like the film when they saw it without sound, and that John had come to you because the film was at risk to quickly put a soundtrack together. And then when they saw it with the music, that's when the studio said, we got something. And in fact...
Yeah. As I recall, it was very much something like that. But the anecdote that sticks with me is not Halloween, which, I mean, again, John had ideas. He did not come in with any picture. We did that seat of the pants, flying. He would describe what he was trying to do, and we made a soundtrack. I mean, there was no money, and I understand he didn't have any operating cash at that moment either. No, it's The Fog that was fascinating, and it's worth retelling because he came to us. by then I had a going studio, Sound Arts, and we had a decent budget for The Fog, and we went ahead and made a darn fine score to The Fog. And John went to release it, and it was an absolute disaster. The people who put a rating on the film gave it essentially a PG rating. And John makes horror films. People do not go to a horror film that is rated PG. So it literally could not be released. It had to have some type of adult only or over 14 rating. So he had to reshoot and re-edit many more minutes of film with blood and gore and put it into The Fog so that it would become a horror film, which meant that we had to rescore.
Ooh, that's a story we're going to be coming back
the
to.
whole film.
Wow.
And,
okay. I didn't know you
so
rescored The Fog twice.
We scored, 3 times.
3 times. And now I found it interesting when I was researching this episode and looking for copies of the Fog cover. I have the original, is it Varse? They released a lot of soundtracks. The original one. And I have a comment here from Frank Martin saying he could have just used naked people instead. Okay. So I noticed that with The Fog, there's a newer release that talks about extra material. And I thought when you go back and score the thing 3 times, I wonder if that, like years later, you go, oh, there's this other stuff, and then you can do a new album of extra material.
The way films work, the producer owns everything. And so when they're done with a session, they take the masters, they take everything with them. Absolutely everything. So a studio owns nothing. A studio musician owns nothing. The orchestrator owns nothing. Not only that, it was analog. That was all on tape. And if you don't like something, rather than spend another $125 for a roll of 2-inch tape, you just record over it. And so all of those potential different pieces of musical cues or songs, they're gone. They get recorded over, they get thrown away. Mostly they get thrown away. Or they stay, as with Apocalypse Now, they stay in somebody's attic for the next 40 years.
So is that the David Shore score that got released later of Apocalypse Now?
David Shire.
Shire, sorry.
That's right. Yeah, David has an Academy Award for It Goes As It Goes. Norma Ray is the film. David is a wonderful film composer and the brother-in-law of Francis Coppola. So David Shire did The Conversation with Francis, and then he was hired to do Apocalypse. And yes, he was the composer for the first score to Apocalypse Now, and I was the contracted orchestrator, electronic musician for it.
For his score or for what came after?
For his score. For
Okay.
his score, which means that what you hear in Apocalypse Now is not ours. But there is a CD out on
Yes.
La La Land Records that you can hear the first score.
Cool. I saw that first score was out. I was wondering whether or not you had worked on it.
The first score we worked on for 2 years with Francis. And at some point, as you can read in that released CD, David had an argument with Francis in the middle of the film, because we had been contracted for 2 solid years, and David and his brother-in-law, soon to be ex-brother-in-law, were not getting along, and David took another film in the middle. He took a film called Fast Breaks, which was a great, fun basketball film. And Francis got mad that David would work on a different film while he was still contracted to be doing Apocalypse Now. So he threw out the score, which meant we left. And some folks in white coats came into our studio and collected all the tapes, except for a few which remained in someone's attic for 35 years.
And that's how the first score eventually got released.
That's correct.
By finding those scores.
That's exactly correct. For many years, no one even knew it existed.
Now, we've been talking about different soundtrack scores, and as folks know who've been watching the show, I found that even playing my own music, once I release it, Facebook just drops the audio. It says, oh, I detect a song that's been released, remove that audio. So I didn't want to talk over this piece, but I do want, for folks that have never heard the Halloween soundtrack, I think it's fair to say that's the single most famous, from a fame standpoint, thing in your repertoire. So I'm going to play a little bit of it with some pictures showing some text that John has talked about with you. All right, that's a little bit. If you've never heard the soundtrack to Halloween, that theme is pretty well known. When I moved to Seattle, the first person I had lunch with, I mentioned going to school and learning from Dan, and he immediately started humming the theme and knew all about it. And so I wanted to give it a little moment there. But these quotes are moving a little fast for the text. But basically, it looks like John over the years recognized that what he brought to you was rough trade, and that if it wasn't for you, it would have ended up being finished product, and in fact, it saved the film. So you mentioned doing that score, and he mentions in one of the quotes, starting in a little brick building, and here's a picture of that brick building with the first sound arts set up, and then here's the later picture. Beautiful studio. And then this is buddy, was Dave? The drummer?
Dave Smith on
Dave
drums,
Smith.
yeah.
And
Fine
Dave,
studio drummer, yeah. That's our control room that you will get showing there. The studio personnel of the previous control room, we had several iterations of sound arts, and you're showing. You've shown several of a brick building that's pretty crude, and that would have been the one that John knew. And then a beautiful control room that was a one-of-a-kind design architect created. And we built a team of us.
Gorgeous studio. And what year was that?
We finally dug up the money for that after Apocalypse Now, so that would have been 1979, 1980.
Was Apocalypse the main funding for that the new studio?
It was a combination of Apocalypse and multiple albums for disco. We did multiple albums for Donna Summers, for the producer Giorgio Moroder. Would you like another anecdote? Do you have time for another anecdote?
Sure. Folks, I normally go to 6 o'clock and go to after party, but I realize we haven't even finished the first 2/3 of the pre-after party. So we're just going to, if you're okay with that, we're going to keep going. And I see folks, wave hi. Do post your messages if you have a question for Dan for the after party, and we'll pick it up then. And let's see, what's the second slide? Oh, yeah. Okay. So give me some anecdotes, and then we're going to move on to your second film scoring career.
A quick anecdote is that Giorgio Moroder had This was an Italian-German producer who had a young blues singer who had an incredible voice. She was singing in Germany. Her name was Donna Summers. He made an album of something he thought would be really hit the charts, which was disco music, and recorded it in Europe, and went to LA to finish mastering. And someone in LA, and that person will be nameless, no, it wasn't me, lost the bass track to a song that he particularly liked called I Feel Love. And for those who are my age, they will maybe remember that that was one of the principal famous songs of all disco music. And it had a bass line that was incredibly important. Well, this engineer, who shall remain nameless, was beside himself because he had just ruined what Giorgio would think was a hit track. And I got called because I was the resident guru of fixing all things recording and electronic. And the poor guy played me a cassette machine, brought in the 24-track tape and said, can you restore the bass line to this music, because otherwise I'll never work again in this industry. And I may end up with a jukebox around my name, around my head in the Caribbean. And we reproduced the bass line to I Feel Love, and it worked. It took a little bit of doing, and so we ended up doing 2 albums for Donna Summers in that studio that you've just seen the pictures of.
And you worked with a bunch of other pop bands. Here's a little sample. So again, because playing any commercial music would be a problem, I felt that was kind of similar to I Feel Loved, and wanted to give people a sense of that. And then you saw the band Sparks there with Giorgio Moroder, who also produced a couple albums for them. And Sound Arts produced a couple albums for Sparks, Oingo Boingo, Devo, et cetera, et cetera. So you didn't just work on soundtracks, you worked in this pop rock space too. Berlin?
Oh, yeah. Berlin, let's see here, bunch of others. I mean, I was a gun for hire.
And that all went through the Sound Art studio.
No, I got hired by, whoever needed me. Beach Boys was always RCA Studio C. Sloop John B is one of the, believe it or not, I did sound processing on that cut, which goes way back. So no, I just go wherever I was needed with all of those synthesizers you just saw in the pictures you were showing. We had professional instrument movers pick up all the synthesizers. They were insured, and they would get set up before I would waltz into any given studio. So whether it was Stevie Wonder, or it was Donna Summers someplace else, or just any number of people, you just go in and play. And TV also. So television sessions with 60 people on a soundstage still wanted a synthesizer with all those boxes just to play one weird sound after counting 54 measures in and then playing beep and leaving. But hey, it paid the rent.
This just always makes me think of going back to the city of Ur. bit of a stretch perhaps, but that moment in which civilization happens and the stratification of civilization happens, and we hear about the lineage of kings, this king, this king, this king. Now, none of those people would be anything if it wasn't for all the people farming the food, all the people doing the transportation, all the people managing the inventory, etc. So I used to torture my family every year when they would say, hey, do you want to say something for Thanksgiving? And I would thank everybody from end to end who got that food to my mouth. And it strikes me that the music industry is no different. It's filled with a lot of hardworking, talented people doing a lot of things that we don't necessarily hear about. And because you're gun for hire, they've got the funds, they've got the name, and they need someone to make magic happen. And you get a reputation for making magic happen, and voila, you're in the bag. They're the person they're going to call. Now, years later, you get a call, you start doing some stuff for a friend's son, and you do a movie. And by the way, the guy in Seattle knew Dead Pit. He could quote from Dead Pit as well. And I thought it was fascinating because as a psychologist student, you know, Agnew's and the story you told about them dressing up homeless at Agnew's, you know, here was this area with a psych place that had been shut down during the Reagan administration, the California Reagan administration. And they'd shot this zombie film out there. And, you know, it was like, I'm a professor. I have this fame for having worked on Halloween and whatnot. So I do some little horror things on the side. And then he got sort of tagged as the next Stephen King filmmaker, like The Children of the Corn and all those sort of Stephen King adaptions. And since you were his scoring guy, you got to come on board. And suddenly it had a bigger name, bigger budget. And then, of course, they decided to take the movie a whole different direction that had nothing to do with Stephen King, and that was a whole nother story. But when I was in grad school, Lawnmower Man, that for me was the first thing where I went to a movie theater and I saw your name in credits.
Yeah. I wish the sound had been as loud as my credits, but yeah, that was 1992.
Got it. And
that was fun. That was great fun. Brett Leonard was the producer.
Was Missing the last film you had done before Dead Pit?
Yes. No. I did a CBS movie of the week called Treasure of the Amazon. I wish it had been Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
I did not see that on your IMDb.
But, yeah, I guess it's a well-known secret.
Well, Lawnmower Man certainly happened, and that was very instructive to me. I want to move back to the pop because Lawnmower Man was really on that edge of my grad school. And since we have so much to talk about, I'd love to bring you back for a second episode where we talk about my grad school years, the Theremins and Lawnmower Man in greater depth. Looping back to those pop bands, that Sparks album you worked on, I was a Sparks fan, but I'd never heard that album. It was their 81s with Cool Places and stuff like that I heard. And then I heard some early stuff. And in the mid 2000s, I pulled out Number One Song in Heaven, put it on the turntable, and I heard this choral pad. And it was exactly the same choral pad I'd played on a San Jose State recording that ended up on a later Audio Terrorist album called Phoenix. And I'm like, this sounds exactly like Phoenix. Who did this album? And I flip it over and there's your name. So it's just another case of where we've had this intertwining, or I've experienced this intertwining with Dan Wyman all my life. He just pops out of nowhere and does something similar. And some of the music you sent me for this show, I'm like, oh, that sounds a lot like that. That sounds a lot like that. And I find it just fascinating how maybe there's just some genetics that, some branch of your genetics and mine came together. And so we have some sensibilities that are similar. And even the I Feel Loved, the Queer Blue sex toy remixes, one of the remixes has an I Feel Loved kind of bass part. And I'm like, how does this happen? It's just this cosmic experience. I don't know. And so you've had all these students over your professorship, and you just, I guess, never know what weaves in and out of that.
It's all connected, huh? It's all connected.
I'm going to take a look at the chat here and see what folks are saying.
And we can do this again, so that's fine.
That work for you?
Any questions?
That's what I'm going to look at for now.
I thought maybe Frank wanted to know what instruments we were using in those days. I don't see it on the chat.
Hey, Frank, I know you're out there. Post any questions about instruments that Dan was using. And you used on Halloween, that was a Moog modular. Frank says, okay, a couple of quotes here, shout out. Sorry, jumping in. Frank was talking about the EMU, but that was the E2.
That's later.
Yeah. I don't know why Stefan said I used to play The Legend of the Red Dragon on a BBS. Oh, I guess we're just talking about the bulletin board stuff. Joe Price says, I remember Mike Jennings. Mike Jennings is still out there, Joe. He's still alive. You should send him a message. My mother says, replying to a friend of hers, are you still with us? Yeah, my streaming shows that we're still with you. He says, I saw an emu. But any other questions for Dan, Frank, about synthesizers, early area of modular, and that sort of thing? I think Frank may have left the building because I'm not seeing a later piece. Oh, I see. This is different.
The synthesizer that I used didn't include Serge. We couldn't trust the Serge system. There were a bunch of the early synthesizers, including Buchla, that we couldn't trust for film and album work. The Buchlas were fine for avant-garde concert music stuff, like what Mort Subotnick was doing. But when I went into a session and people were paying me double scale, I had to know for sure that they would produce for me. And as you saw earlier with John's comment, it was crude. Even the Moog was crude. You had to keep tuning the keyboards in those days. So in the studio there was an Oberheim, but there were no Serge. We had mini Moogs, we had Moogs. Eventually we did have modular EMU, but that was already by the time we did Apocalypse Now. So we didn't use any of those for the early stuff.
Got it. And Joe Price says, do you find that over the years, the advancement of technology used for composition and production of music make such pursuits more accessible and affordable to budding musicians?
Yeah, I mean, because of the hard work of so many skilled software engineers over the last 30 years plus, the whole concept of music has been turned on its ear and makes it much more interesting and approachable to everybody. But what goes along with that is the demand for many people that there is more originality, more style difference that intrigues people, and more professionality for the tough stuff that you just can't let a computer or the software on any given computer take over for you. You've got, that's too easy. And so it takes even more skill now often. And we don't appreciate those people as much. I mean, you listen to the music by Howard Shore, for instance, in film, not just John Williams. And these are consummately skilled human beings, and they can use synthesizers too. But you're going to hire someone like me even now to program computers if you want original sounds instead of taking somebody's samples. So yeah, it's cool. It's wonderful that there's more access to music, but now there's more demand for originality, more demand for something interesting, and maybe a certain amount of fickleness because of that, where we settle for less, maybe at this point.
Thank you for
because
that.
there's so much available.
And thank you for the question, Joe. We should talk more offline. Joe, I describe as he is the poet. He is the describer. He is the chronicler of the entire San Francisco Bay Area, who's largely unknown. But his writings and posts, whether on blogs, Facebook, or just that question, are incredibly articulate. Joe is a part of many, many different communities in the Bay Area, from motorcycling, from the Renaissance Fair that used to be in Marin, to the science fiction conventions, to all the nightclubs of San Francisco. He's just an incredibly nice, well-balanced guy who seems to know everybody and everybody knows him. And I'm trying to encourage him to write a book about the San Francisco Bay Area and his journeys and take all of his writings. So that was really cool to get that question from him. Let's see. Frank Martin said, okay, you saw the Surge synth. Thank you, Dan, for all his amazing work. I have to say the score from Halloween.
Planet was done by the Barons, and they are central to the history of electronic music itself. The incredible original composers. They had a little studio in Glendale, California. Forbidden Planet was a generation ahead of its time. Amazing score.
Absolutely, definitely one of the key scores. For me, again, still second to Close Encounters, but yeah, still a key score. I love Close Encounters because it was John being experimental versus I think the other stuff he does is fairly, while talented, more conventional.